Greetings. I am Robert and I now reside in Dallas, Texas. The city is large and bustling with opportunities, but it also has its share of problems, as do most communities. The marketing agency where I work isn't exactly a dream job, but it's paying the bills, and I've been working my way up the ladder. Truthfully, I've always been the kind of person who follows procedures to the letter, is punctual, does a good job, keeps his chin down, and lets events unfold as they may. That was all before I met Megan. On Monday, it began like any other Monday. My employer, Mr. Charles, summoned me to his office as I sipped my morning coffee and reviewed the routine emails. Mr. Charles is an honest man, perhaps in his mid to late 50s. You don't mess with him, but you also respect him as a boss. After 20 years at the helm, he is still unforgiving of incompetence and sloppiness. I went into his office anticipating the typical fare of a new customer or project update, but he surprised me with something quite different. My daughter, Megan, would want to meet you, Robert. She'll be staying for a long, so I'd appreciate it if you could assist her in getting situated in. I have faith in you to lead her by the hand, Mr. Charles said in a solemn but collected tone. I attempted to conceal my astonishment. His daughter's impending arrival at the firm was news to me. I had no clue he had a daughter at all. I was surprised by how drastically different Megan, who was introduced to me by Mr. Charles, was from my expectations. She was in her early 20s. Her self-assurance was so striking that it threatened to intimidate. She was more than simply a wealthy daughter bearing her father's surname. Megan, on the other hand, was perceptive and had the type of confidence that is often reserved for those who have earned their success. Well, hello there, Robert. It was nice to meet you, she said, her hand outstretched and gently grasped. No signs of anxiety or need for reassurance were detected. She had an air of complete command. A little sense of being overwhelmed washed over me. It was clear to me that she was assessing me as we made some small talk. Megan seemed independent and didn't need anybody to guide her. I wasn't sure what she wanted from me, however. She came prepared to make an impression, and I was just the person assigned to teach her the ropes. I tried to seem certain as I assured Mr. Charles that I would look after her well. Mr. Charles gave a thumbs-up sign. I have faith that you will succeed. All you have to do is bring her up to speed on what we're doing. I couldn't help but sense that something was strange as I walked out of his office. After putting in a couple of years of dedicated work and striving for advancement, I felt like I was being passed over when Megan strode into the office like the boss. I had no clue about her intentions, but I sensed that this would be harder than I anticipated. To put it mildly, what followed was an eventful few days. When it came to Megan, very little direction was required. She showed no signs of being here only to capitalize on her last name as she rapidly grasped the nuances of the job. Her intellect was acute, and she always knew just what to do. I felt like I was more than simply her mentor because of the way she engaged with me. When she talked to me, an inexplicable sparkle appeared in her eyes. I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't interested. At first, I didn't get it. Her desire and determination were admirable, on the one hand. However, I must admit that I was beginning to have some unease. There was an apparent connection between us, and I was unsure of how to handle it, even though she didn't seem to be the sort to be readily impressed. I started to worry how deep I was in danger as the days went by. I had no clue about Megan's true motives, but I sensed that this wouldn't be as simple as I had anticipated. Not to mention that was just the start. It's ironic how circumstances may shift unexpectedly. Just when you thought everything was getting back to normal, something unexpected happens. That is precisely how I felt after Megan's first week of our collaboration. My expectations were completely misguided. I had no idea what to anticipate. I got to know Megan more throughout the subsequent days. She has exceptional intelligence, self-assurance, and skill. She was quite independent and had little trouble picking up new skills. She wasn't simply looking for an internship to get her foot in the door of the corporate world. That was my initial assumption. Work was Megan's purpose here, and she excelled at it. She never made a fuss or seemed to be entitled to anything. She kept her identity as the daughter of Mr. Charles a secret. She hardly even brought it up. However, there was an underlying quality about her, an unstated comprehension that she was not obliged to demonstrate anything. Every day, she demonstrated it through her actions. Our customer had us develop a marketing plan, which was a massive undertaking that included many late nights and creative brainstorming sessions. There was nothing particularly noteworthy throughout the first few days. As usual, I was directing, explaining, and checking in to make sure everything was running well. However, changes started to take place as time progressed. Megan would inquire, but her inquiries would be unconventional. The reason she wasn't asking was because she was confused. She had an opinion, a strong one, and she wanted to know more, so she asked. It never failed to surprise me whenever she spoke out with one of her suggestions. She carried herself with an air of self-assurance and a keen intellect. It was confident without being haughty. We were reviewing the most recent client campaign draft at my desk one day. Megan drew forward, her arm touching mine as she gestured toward the television. In this case, why not attempt something riskier? Her voice was steady yet forceful as she made her suggestion. Making a good impression is important, so we'll be cautious and try to blend in. People need to notice us. Astounded by her offer, I stared at her for a while. Although her method wasn't what I had envisioned, I couldn't ignore its attractiveness. Going with the flow wouldn't be effective, she was correct. Safe doesn't sell, as I'd seen with previous clientele. In contrast, I had always preferred to use time-tested approaches. You have no idea. My reluctance was evident in my voice as I spoke. Perhaps that's not quite safe enough. Megan seemed to be thinking about what I said because she arched an eyebrow. Is it daring or safe? When we locked gazes, I almost lost my line of thought. Something was off with the way her eyes met mine. She seemed to be flirting with me, rather than aggressively confronting me. It seemed more as if she was encouraging me to be creative. Just as I was about to reply, Mr. Charles came briskly past and stopped at our desk. So far, so good, right? Hey, Robert. Looking down at the screen, he inquired. A little taken aback by Megan's idea and the sudden change in my attention, I agreed. Yeah, that's great. I have faith that the two of you will collaborate to provide the customer with an excellent solution. Says Mr. Charles, grinning. Your father has faith in you, Megan. Keep that in mind. It's okay to take chances. His remarks lingered for much longer than I had anticipated. I could see that Megan was hiding something, even if her expression was expressionless. It wasn't like she was only following orders or trying to avoid danger. Her purpose in being here was to leave her own imprint. Returning to Megan, I turned after Mr. Charles departed. With laser-like concentration, she was immediately pounding away on the keyboard. Something had changed between us, however, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation. It was her demeanor, it was her manner of pushing me. It seemed strange in some way. As time went on, it became even more apparent. It was more than simply a job for Megan. Mrs. Charles was more than simply her father's daughter. She posed a threat to me because of that. Someone who prompted me to reconsider assumptions I had previously taken for granted. Also, I wasn't sure if I liked it or not. Both of us stayed late that night at the workplace to iron out some kinks. A deafening silence pervaded the workplace. There was an unusual tension in the air, even though there were just the two of us. I wasn't used to this level of stress. It wasn't hostile, but it lingered between us, silent and unsaid. I gathered all of my belongings and got to my feet to go as soon as we finished. Megan, I will meet with you tomorrow. Everything was normal, I responded, attempting to seem nonchalant. Remarkably, she remained still. On the contrary, she fixed her expressionless gaze on me. Excuse me, Robert, but I have a question. She spoke at a lower volume than normal. I froze, my attention returning to her. Yes, of course. Doing well? She looked at me closely as she paused before speaking again. Have you ever felt that you're only doing the tasks at hand? I feel like everything is in place, but it's not really mine. I was slow to respond. To be honest, I hadn't given much consideration to the subject in that light previously. For the most part, I had always gone with the flow, kept my head down, and played it safe. I wasn't expecting the impact of Megan's remarks, however. So what? Perhaps I have. I spoke slowly, unsure of why I was being quite forthright. Her eyes betrayed a hint of knowledge as she cracked a little grin. It is not necessary, you know. Suddenly, it seemed as if something had changed once again. I couldn't run away from it, even though I had no idea what it was. I could no longer maintain the facade that everything was ordinary, because Megan was unique. Everything happened in a whirl in the days after that chat with Megan. Nothing she said was really noteworthy. Something about her being there, however, stuck with me. Perhaps it was the expression on her face. She seemed to be daring me to leave my comfort zone with her challenging words. Perhaps it was because someone had dared to challenge my habit, that secure haven I had constructed around myself, which had not happened in quite some time. Still, I couldn't get rid of it, even though I despised it. Nothing changed at work while Megan was around, yet you could feel a change in the atmosphere. She had become more than simply another coworker. There was more to her than just being the boss's daughter. Everyone took notice of her because of her indisputable charisma. She had more than simply a high IQ and remarkable organizational skills. Her demeanor gave the impression that she was always one step ahead of the competition. Even though I'd always considered myself to be a very controlling person, I was beginning to feel like I was slipping away. A few days down the road, as I was winding down yet another lengthy workweek and completing a handful of reports, I saw Megan making her way toward my desk. Today, she seemed different, as if she had more to do than just come to work. Her every stride had a purpose. As she paused in front of my desk, a little grin spread over her face. She spoke to Robert in a calm yet inquisitive tone. I have been contemplating. I feel like we need to have a more in-depth conversation on our plan now that you've been so helpful with the job. Would you want to go out to dinner with me this evening? Allow me to pick your brain for a little longer. Hungry stomach. It wasn't a major issue, but her tone of voice made me think twice. This supper had nothing to do with business. There was no pomp and circumstance. I was taken aback by how intimate it seemed. My first reaction was to decline, as I wanted to maintain a level head. However, I chose not to do so. Excuse me, I replied, attempting to come off as not too serious. Where did your thoughts go? Her eyes widened in a mischievous grin. You should go to this site. Sure, I can send you the specifics, by text message. She abruptly turned and left, leaving me with a sense of unease, before I had a chance to speak. I was intrigued, maybe too so, by the prospect of what lay ahead, even though I knew nothing about it. The invitation to dinner with Megan came as a surprise, and I was confused about its significance. Has it just got to do with work? On the other hand, was there a deeper meaning behind it? As I got dressed that night, I paced around my apartment, trying to convince myself not to do it. Were we not just having dinner? Not much to get from this. However, I found myself more curious about her intentions as the minutes passed. Especially with the boss's daughter, I had no desire to breach any boundaries, but I also wasn't foolish enough to disregard the growing tension between us. I make it to the hip downtown eatery on time. It had a sleek, minimalist vibe. At the window seat, Megan was already there. Wearing a modest black dress that accentuated her figure without going overboard, she exuded an aura of casual sophistication with her dark hair tied up in a tight ponytail. Outside of work, she had a different appearance. Relaxed, less guarded. Her passion and calm confidence, which made her stand out, remained, nevertheless. My name is Robert. I walked over to the table, and she stood up to meet me with a grin. That you were able to attend is much appreciated. Sitting across from her, I made an effort to maintain my composure. It was hard for me to tell whether I felt anxious or just uneasy. I was really confused. Then, what exactly is going on here? I inquired, attempting to come off as carefree. You said that you were interested in consulting with me on the strategy. With her gaze fixed on me the whole time, Megan reclined in her chair. Sure, that's part of it. With a silky voice, she said. However, Robert, I was also hoping to learn more about you. You're rather mysterious, aren't you? Not understanding what she was getting at, I arched an eyebrow. A mystery? Her face lit up with a grin. Yeah, you're somewhat reserved and not really extroverted. Although you excel in your role, there is an additional aspect to consider. Mysterious information that you are trying to conceal. I felt my pulse quicken in response to her fearless comments. I was unaccustomed to being the center of attention. I had always been the one who kept secrets and asked probing questions. When it came to Megan, however, I felt like I was falling apart in ways words couldn't describe. As I attempted to seem casual, I responded, I'm not hiding anything, even though I was starting to feel uncomfortable. My job life and my personal life are completely different. That's the one that's easier. Megan maintained unbroken eye contact. Possibly yes. However, I am not getting an adequate response to my query from you. Is anything really wrong with you? There was a sudden, stinging pull on my chest. Neither with her nor with anything else was I willing to let my guard down. It was difficult to lie to her because of the way she looked at me. It was as if she could see straight through me. Uncomfortably, I moved in my chair, attempting to redirect the conversation. Where do you stand, then? To divert attention, I inquired. Tell me how you got into this field. I get that your dad runs the business, but you don't strike me as the kind to blindly follow in his footsteps. Softly, Megan giggled, a knowing grin teasing the edges of her mouth. So many people assume that, it's crazy. My opinion is that this is a worthwhile endeavor. It has nothing to do with my surname. The focus is on my independent abilities. Nodding, I was at a loss for words. The topic was becoming more weighty, and the boundary between the two realms was beginning to blend. Business wasn't Megan's only interest. I didn't know what to do when she showed interest in me. She had this irresistible charisma that made me fall for her against my better judgment. However, I was unable to risk getting too near. That was already made clear to me. The night progressed, and I could feel the tension rising between us. It felt as if we were both avoiding talking about something that was there, but that neither of us wanted to face head-on. I couldn't get the idea that what was going between us as I walked out of the restaurant that night. It went beyond surface level, and I worried about maintaining denial for how much longer. Even more so than the typical pressures of work and deadlines, the days following our supper seemed weighed down. Some subtle quality was there that I couldn't identify. I couldn't shake Megan's statements from the previous night. You're a mystery to me. For so long, I had kept things near to heart, but suddenly I felt precariously poised between holding on and letting go. And what's worse? When it started, I wasn't sure I could stop it. As usual, I got up early the next day, grabbed some coffee, checked my email, and got to work. However, suddenly there was a nuanced distinction. Megan had become more than simply another employee. There was more to her than that. Something was off with her expressions and the way she spoke to me. It seemed like the supper had been everything but casual to me. Underneath everything, there was something I hadn't quite recognized yet, but it seemed difficult to ignore. I decided to go to the break room about lunchtime in an effort to get some air and relax. Seeing Megan was completely unexpected, yet there she was the moment I went inside. She was chatting with a few coworkers when one of them made a comment that made her giggle. The moment she caught sight of me, however, her grin faded. It was almost as if she was anticipating my arrival. Robert, she murmured, her voice kind but carrying an air of mystery that I failed to discern. You have been on my search. I felt more vigilant than I should have been, so I arched an eyebrow. Seeking my presence? I didn't anticipate being difficult to locate. Leaning nonchalantly against the counter, she grinned. I was hoping to get a quick update. After last night's supper, you didn't seem like yourself. Is everything all right? To maintain a light-hearted tone, I nodded. Yeah, I'm okay with it. So much is piling up for me. The tension between us was palpable even as I said those words. The tension at work was above what is typically experienced. The night we spent together was still buzzing with electricity. There was an unsaid something that lingered in the air between us. Do you really believe that? I was the only one Megan ever looked at. Because something is odd about you. And after dinner, you still haven't texted me back. She was absolutely correct, and I only just now understood it. Without making an effort, I had let the night to pass by. It was only supper, I had persuaded myself, it was all business. Still, I got a feeling there was more going on. Megan was now advocating for something. I wasn't sure whether I was prepared for anything. My voice quivered as I attempted to explain that I did not believe it was essential. There was no change in Megan's face. It's my suggestion that we have more conversations. You have a good idea of the future. Perhaps not. Perhaps you have no interest in any of it. My pulse rate increased. She seemed to be playing a joke on me. On the other hand, was her intention to understand me sincere? In any case, I had the impression that she was toying with me. I felt nervous just thinking about it. My tone was rather harsher than I had hoped, but I still don't understand what you're saying. Megan maintained an unwavering grin. However, her eyes now had a deeper hue. I believe you do. However, discussing it is unnecessary. At least not just yet. But you should know that I may choose to leave things unresolved, Robert. I felt as if a wave of doubt had just swept over me as she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there. What had occurred just now? Was my thoughts going too far? Was she trying to force me into anything, though? Whatever this was, I couldn't escape the notion that I couldn't just walk away from it. I was completely distracted that afternoon. I felt a strong pull toward Megan that made my job and obligations seem insignificant. This thing between us isn't going away, I vowed to myself. I would maintain an air of professionalism. But it seemed like the limits I had put in place were being dismantled every time we crossed paths. As the day came to a close and the office began to pack up, Megan and I found ourselves on the elevator. Whatever was bothering her at the moment, she was likely replying to emails on her phone. However, her closeness was palpable to me. Everything wasn't only outward. The dense air surrounding us was a result of the passion between us. Megan walked out in front of me as soon as the elevator doors opened, and I glanced over her shoulder as I did so. As if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, she asked if we might have dinner again tomorrow night. I was hesitant. I should have said no and set limits before things got out of hand. Instead, I did what I had done before, I nodded. Of course. Even though I wasn't sure why I was agreeing, I went ahead and said it nevertheless. I was filled with apprehension as the doors shut behind me, unable to fathom what was ahead. There was already a blurring of boundaries between work and personal life, and tomorrow night would make matters worse. Without realizing it, I had crossed a boundary. There was no going back at this point. A haze enveloped the next day. It didn't matter how much I tried, I just couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were going 1,000 miles per hour, and the workplace seemed like a foreign realm where everyone seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. The way Megan had looked at me, with that blend of inquisitiveness and something more profound, kept playing back in my mind as I thought about our talk. A mix of excitement and fear would wash over me whenever I considered it. I was terrified of what would happen when I realized I had exceeded a boundary. The day seemed to go on forever, and as the clock struck 5, I found myself eagerly anticipating my departure. I didn't despise the task itself. It was the burden of all the unsaid things that hung over Megan and me. Our scheduled supper kept popping into my head. Even though she had stated it lightly, I could tell there was more going on. Would you say she was putting me through my paces? If so, was she being serious? From this whole ordeal, what did she want to gain? I told myself I wouldn't allow her to influence me and attempted to brush it off. However, I couldn't help but feel a familiar nudge in my gut as I emerged from the office and saw her patiently waiting by her vehicle. I momentarily lost track of my uncertainties and the limits I was expected to uphold as her grin greeted me. "Hey," she said, her voice casual as if we were two individuals out for supper after a hard day on the job. However, I could feel the electric current, the undercurrent, between us, and I had a feeling that she could too. "Hey," I said, attempting to seem natural. "Is everyone prepared?" She confirmed my suspicions as she joined me on the way to my vehicle. "There is no food for me." I could sense the heavy, obvious tension in the air, even though the journey was silent at first. Though she wasn't speaking much, Megan would sometimes steal my gaze with a glance that sent shivers down my spine. Like we were in the middle of a game, but we had no idea what the rules were. The restaurant was a serene, posh spot in the city, and Megan took the lead when we got there. I felt like I was tripping over my own ideas, but she seemed calm and assured. Sitting down at the little table in the corner, I knew I couldn't keep acting like this was any old business meal. It was unique. We had an undeniable connection that none of us could ignore. As she leaned back in her chair and studied me intently, she said, "Where is everyone at work? Today, you seem to be a little preoccupied." I paused, seeking the appropriate phrase. What was really happening, and how could I describe it? I found it more difficult to concentrate whenever she was in the room. That I felt dragged in further with each look she gave me. "It's fine," I answered, attempting to maintain an upbeat tone. "There is just so much for me to do, you know?" With a nod, Megan refrained from asking any more questions. She was quite pleasant to chat to at all times, and I despised the strong want to continue our conversations. However, this was not intended to transpire. I worked for her father. Maintaining an air of professionalism was expected of me. However, my efforts to resist were met with increasing resistance. We placed our orders as the waiter approached, the fog of anxiety continuing to hang over us. I was taken aback by the intensity and tenderness in Megan's eyes as soon as he departed. As she spoke, her voice was low and careful. She revealed that she had been considering our relationship. A wave of nausea washed over me as I took in the words. What was the gist of her statement? As I attempted to decipher her true meaning, my thoughts raced. Us. Even though I was far from steady, I tried to maintain my voice steady as I repeated. It took a while for Megan to respond. Instead, she paused to drink her wine and looked at me as if she were considering what to say next. Her voice was low and somewhat playful when she eventually spoke. "I believe you understand," she murmured, her lips slightly upturned. "I can still affect you, even when you don't believe it." Not knowing what to say, I swallowed hard. She had a point. I was still vulnerable to her. However, it didn't imply I want for things to go further. There was more at play here than meets the eye. Problems arose when an inappropriate boundary was crossed. I was about to utter a word, to inform her that we had to end this immediately and make a change, but I refrained. However, I was unable to do so as she leaned closer, her intense gaze fixed on mine. "I can see you're trying to fight it, but I don't believe you want it anymore," she whispered to Robert. "No, really." As if she were issuing a challenge, her words caused my chest to stiffen. It seemed as like she had complete insight into my innermost thoughts and emotions. She had a knack for getting under my skin and making me doubt my self-assuredness. I tried to utter anything else, but this time it remained silent. I was at a loss for words. Our current course of action was wrong, and I was at a loss as to how to break it to her. Still, I found myself sinking into something I wasn't prepared for as I gazed into her eyes. Everything after that supper flew by, and Megan wouldn't even let me pay with the check. She was adamant about hiding it with a smile, which made me feel both grateful and frightened. The sensation that I was going off the rails persisted as we made our way from the eatery to the parking lot. Even though I had no idea where this was leading, I felt helpless against it. The days that followed seemed to go on interminably. The aura of Megan's presence was palpable the moment I entered the workplace. It would all come flooding back whenever I caught her look, even if there were times when I believed everything were back to normal. Everything that we had both chosen to disregard for far too long, the tension, the implicit remarks. I couldn't keep acting like this wasn't an issue after that supper. I kept thinking that there was no turning back now that we had passed a boundary. The situation had spiraled out of control, and our only option was to act swiftly. Stop it before it got out of hand. It was difficult. Even though Megan hadn't mentioned anything again, I could sense that she was anticipating my response. And I could feel that pressure, that desire, to give in and let things escalate every time I saw her at the workplace. Although I wanted to, I couldn't. This is no longer the case. At last, I gave in to it on a Friday afternoon. She needed to hear from me. Things would deteriorate worse if I did nothing. Upon entering, I saw that she was seated at her desk, looking up at me. Even though I couldn't read her face, I could feel my pulse racing from the intensity of her gaze. "Shall we have a conversation?" I inquired, speaking more calmly than I really felt. Without once taking her eyes off of mine, she nodded. "It is obvious. Does anything bemuse you at the moment?" In an effort to collect my thoughts, I took a long breath. "Allow me to clarify this for you." I was counting on her to comprehend. "Megan," I started to sound quite serious. "I can't turn a blind eye to what transpired between us. This seems wrong, and I know we've both experienced it. I would prefer not to put everything at risk by repeatedly going beyond." After a little silence, she returned her gaze to that unintelligible face and gazed at me. I even had the fleeting fear that maybe she wasn't getting my point. Later on, however, she did speak, but her voice was hardly audible. "Sure, I am aware." Her reaction caught me off guard, and I blinked. "Do you realize this?" With a nod, she gave her consent. It was very clear to me. The expectation I had is clear to me. However, I am also aware that it was unfair to you. Whichever way around. "Robert, I apologize. I wasn't prepared for how hard the words would strike. It had occurred to me that I would have to be the one to finally stand up and stop the nonsense. But now she was the one owning up to it and accepting blame. "I apologize as well," I whispered, my own shame rising to the surface. Prior to it reaching this stage, I ought to have intervened. Everything drew me in, but looking back, it was all for nothing. Megan let her shoulders slump slightly as she inhaled deeply, as if a burden had been removed. As her face softened, she cast her final glance in my direction. "Dear Robert, I really regret any harm I may have caused you. I just am unsure. It seemed to me that maybe there was more going on. The timing is wrong, and we can't act like everything is okay anymore, that much is clear to me now." A peculiar sensation of comfort swept over me as I nodded. It was finished. At last, we were on the same page, and I could see that we had made the right choice. Speaking in a calm but somewhat definitive tone, I suggested that we may both benefit from moving on. Standing up from her desk, Megan approached me. A faint grin, sorrowful and understanding, crossed her face as she offered it to me. She expressed her gratitude for being forthright in her speech. "We should just put this behind us. I'm sure we'll be okay." A burden was lifted from my shoulders as I saw her return to her desk. It was finished. Stress is over. Finally, some clarity. We had both decided to put a stop to it before it could do any more harm. A range of feelings washed over me as I walked out of the workplace that day. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that I had chosen well. However, a feeling of loss and melancholy remained. It wasn't that I felt remorse for what had transpired, rather, it was that it was completely unnecessary. Ultimately, we were just two individuals who had been entangled in a web they didn't quite comprehend. We had both discovered the hard way that once we crossed some borders, they are impossible to uncross. Furthermore, moving on from the past was the one option for moving ahead. Despite its difficulty, it remained our exclusive option. Everything was finally over as I stepped out of that office for the last time,